Good, great. Well, thank you, Sinclair, for having me. This is my first time at a Beauty Boss event, and I am so excited to be here that I took a very early morning flight to make it, and it's been great so far. So hopefully all of you are getting great content out of it. As mentioned, I'm a lawyer, and so I'm here to scare you and to take away all the exciting stuff you've learned before lunch and make sure that now you go home with all these worries and whatnot. But no, I'm not here to really scare you. I'm here to hopefully enlighten you and educate you and open your eyes to some of the things that happen to my clients and help you avoid them. I hope that no one ever has to work with a lawyer in their life because lawyers are not always fun. They can be expensive. They don't communicate well, even though that's part of their job. And it's usually something kind of aggressive or contentious when you're working with lawyers most of the time. But that's not what I do. So I am a healthcare lawyer focused on regulatory guidance, corporate work, and transactions. And so my goal is really to help a client take a dream, turn it into a reality, and make sure that along the way, they're aware of all the little things that might be a little hiccup or hurdle, maybe slow them down or take them a few steps back. I want to make sure that we minimize those, mitigate as much potential exposure as possible so that they can focus on what they're very good at, which is the treatment of their patients, running their business, being business owners. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. There are legal threats constantly. They come from all places and all shapes and sizes. And they may not always be the things that you're thinking of, right? So I would say most people would probably say that, if you ask them what's their biggest legal threat, well, maybe it's their patient, right, their client. And that's very true. That's going to be maybe your number one source of, legal issues, or at least your scariest one. But there's a lot of others, and I'll go through those in a moment and kind of some ways that, we work with them. But, when you're owning a business or operating in a business, you're focused on, again, what you're good at, whether you're a licensed provider or you're an owner and you know how to market or sell or whatever it may be. You don't always think about the things that could hurt you and really how investing in time and education and documents, whatever it may be, processes, protocols, will ensure that those are limited interactions, they're minimized, and then you can get back to being what you're really good at, right? So it's good to sometimes take a step back and work on your business and not just in it. And that's kind of the approach we want to take is let's be a little bit preventative, let's educate and make sure that you're aware of these things so you can spot them early on. Or if it does happen, you know that you've taken the steps ahead of time to kind of protect yourself. So patience, I don't want to call it the number one, but probably the number one legal threat that's going to affect your practice, your business. Why? Because you're interacting with them on a healthcare basis, you're maybe injecting or using a laser or device, and something could happen. And it may be something that is well within what might be expected, right? They're a little red, maybe they're a little bit burned from a laser, they have some swelling, whatever it may be, or maybe it can be a little bit more severe and it actually rises to the level of malpractice. And so, in addition to having, insurance, right, to cover you on that, you need to have a process and protocol in place for interacting with your patients. And your staff needs to be trained on how to interact with patients, right? So everything should be the same every single time a patient comes in, new patient, existing patient, right? You have a process for your intake with them, right? They're going to fill out certain paperwork that shares a background of who they are, their health history. You're going to have one of your providers, or if you're the provider, reviewing that, making sure that there are no contraindications for whatever the treatment might be that they're seeking or going to receive. And then most importantly, there's the consent part of it, right? So this is healthcare still, right? And there's still a requirement that patients give consent for these treatments, even though it's elective and cash pay. They're not just a client or a customer buying, a widget in your store. They're receiving something that's, medical, right? Medical grade treatment. And if they're not fully informed about what they're receiving, what the potential adverse risks are, any alternatives that are available to them, and have the opportunity to really discuss the treatment with you, then they're not giving real consent, right? So having a paper that just says, I consent to receiving X is not enough, and it needs to be a bit more than that. And then your staff, whoever is going to be going over that form with them, has to be informed as to how to go through that form, right? So more paperwork, more time, right? I get it, right? Nobody likes the lawyer, but at the end of the day, if you're not doing those things and something happens, we go from a conversation that's not just how do we quickly settle this and maybe we pay nothing or something small to now I got to call my malpractice carrier and say, hey, I didn't document anything appropriately, I don't have consent, you guys got to pick it up, and they're going to be upset with you, and maybe your rates go up because now they're going to pay out a claim. So, you know, if it's not documented, we can't prove anything, we can't defend anything. So the importance of having a process, having a system with your patients and with your staff and making sure your staff is following through on that. I can't tell you how many times having stuff like that has really helped minimize the exposure to a client. So good practice, have trainings quarterly, you know, twice a year, whatever it may be, but at least do it, document those things. That way when something does happen, because it ultimately will, you can go to sleep at night and you're not panicked or calling me at midnight saying, oh my gosh, I just got a letter from a lawyer and they're asking for my insurance and this and that and records. What do I do, right? You still might do that, but at least we can say, hey, you've done everything right. We've prepared for this. Gather what you need to gather, and now we can have a different conversation. Second, employees, right? So patients are probably the most people you deal with, right? That's your biggest volume, and then you've got employees. Employees can be, and sorry to the employees in here, I'm an employee, right? But employees typically are the second most common legal issue I deal with as a lawyer. And it's usually because terms of an arrangement, terms of an agreement are not clear, they're not written out. And it's not always just the employee themselves, right? Maybe it's their behavior otherwise, but there's employment laws, right? Every state has its own set of laws on how you interact with people that you hire and pay and engage. And you can't just do things how you want to do them. I had someone come to me saying, well, I've got a salaried employee and I'm just going to, require them to be here every single day. And if they want to take more paid time off than, I give them, I'm going to start docking them. Well, pump the brakes because there's laws in Florida and federally that will, well, I'm in Florida, but in every state that govern how you interact with patients, how you deduct time and paid time off from them, or how you have to give them benefits. And these things are so overlooked, but as long as an employee is happy, nothing's going to happen. But if you mistreat them, or if you start to do things or change your policies, that's where they might start asking questions or get on Google. And now you've got employment, issues, right? Labor issues. And in many states, there's administrative processes for that include extra damages and punitive penalty damages. So, taking the time to have a process in place with your employees for how you offer them terms, how you hire them. If you're going to offer things like paid trainings, or you're going to pay for their certifications, things like that, right? And then all of a sudden they leave and you want to try to recoup money from them. If these things aren't in writing and also in line with the laws in your state, you may violate those laws and not only have to deal with reimbursing them or giving them something, right? But you may be penalized by your state as well. So, I always find it, it's a hard conversation to have with a business owner when, they're in the wrong, right? And I've got to explain to them, hey, your employee's got a lot more rights here than you, right? So, take the time to, I think, make sure that you understand your laws, and if contracts are required or can be modified, you're doing it appropriately. You're not just deciding to change things, treating people differently, right? Those can be issues that tank a business and turn it into no longer fun for you, but now you're just spending money on stuff that isn't productive, right? Another issue: how many people in here lease space from a third-party landlord, like don't own their premises? Okay, a decent amount. So dealing with landlords, and I deal with landlords all over. Most of the time, the lease that you get is going to be tilted in their favor, right? They own the property, you're coming in, they can do whatever they want, right? You're going to sign a personal guarantee. You're going to give them, first month, last month, security deposits. If anything breaks or goes wrong, they're going to shift it to you. You're going to pay for common area expenses, right? So even though they own it, you're seemingly responsible for a lot of it. And unfortunately, when you sign a lease like that, you're locked in for some time, and you're locked in for the financial aspect of it, and you're locked in for the repairs and things like that. So I received a lease last week from a client of mine. I didn't help review it. They came to me and they said, hey, I'm having an issue. We've got rat infestation, we've got air handler issues, we've got all this stuff, and I've got to shut down. Department of Health came in. What do I do? Your lease doesn't say anything, so how do we know? You look at the statutes of your state, and you try to see what happens there, but the statutes don't always go into details about these specific scenarios. So now my client, unfortunately, is 12 days without working, can't go anywhere else. She's got patients that have follow-ups, right, and she can't go see them elsewhere. She doesn't have a space she can jump into. Her equipment is large, and it's not like she can bring it to her house. And I think a lot of this might have been solved, at least from a financial standpoint, if her lease was a little bit better, right? So, when you're dealing with a third party that you're contracting with, especially when you're promising to, put a lot of money into it, be responsible for certain things, you're going to be there long term, maybe you're going to invest in the build out of it. It's really important to spend a little bit of time, maybe with someone, a real estate agent or a lawyer, to go through it and say, hey, these are the common issues that I see here. And this is the crazy thing that I've seen, right? A rat infestation, right? Who's responsible for it? What happens if I have to shut down because Department of Health closes us for 10 days? Am I paying rent still? Am I going to have some, some freedom here, some leeway? If your lease doesn't talk about that, you're kind of kicked to, the statutes, the laws of your state, which lawyers wrote, and they aren't always thinking about these things, right? So, anytime you're dealing with a third party, I think you can have a contractual relationship that goes south and goes wrong. The next piece of, I would say, legal liabilities, things that are commonly popping up, is really changes in laws. And in healthcare, laws change, feels like daily, and it happens so fast sometimes, and I try to stay up on it, but I'll have clients reach out to me and say, hey, here's a proposed bill that came through, the state Senate. What do you think about this? And it's changing, something very significant, in the state. So in Florida, over the summer, there was a lot of chatter about the Board of Nursing putting out a statement about RNs being able to inject fillers and toxins in Florida. And I didn't, I wasn't following the Board of Nursing that closely, but obviously, there's communities here and people talk and they see things. And it wasn't a change in law, but really it was a change in position. And it happened so fast, and then all of a sudden, for the next 2 months, the Board of Nursing was receiving, petitions to make a statement on how, as an RN in Florida, you could actually inject. And so, that law changed super fast, and it caused a lot of my clients as nurse practitioners, physicians to say, or business owners, how is this going to affect us, and what are we going to do? And all of a sudden, it shifted a lot of people from, trying to work with one type of licensee to a different type of licensee, and understanding when those laws change. And obviously, that was, arguably a positive law for some folks. It can happen the other way, right? It can shift the other way very quickly as well, right? So another example, in Florida, we had a law change where licensure was now required for how IV therapy providers service patients in homes, right? Before there was arguably you didn't have to have a certain license, and then finally there was a statement that changed it. So all of a sudden, thousands of providers that didn't need a license before all of a sudden needed a license, right? So as boards, regulatory bodies, the industry catches up to what's actually happening, laws start to change. And just because you weren't aware of it, ignorance doesn't mean that you're not going to be responsible or liable under it if something changes and you're still operating in the old way. You've got to stay up to date on these things. And there's a lot of resources that you don't need a lawyer necessarily to stay up to date on them. But I will say, when lawyers get involved in writing the law, and they do, right? It's not always clear. And then it's kicked to the board, and the board is supposed to create some sort of regulations and guidance and new process for something. and it can take them 6 months to a year, but the law is actually in effect already. So another example on that, federal laws for prescribing of certain controlled substances. I know we were talking about biohacking and nutrition and different prescriptions, peptides, things like that. Well, you've got 50 states of laws. Every state has its own set of laws. They operate independent of each other. And then you've got the federal government, which creates its own laws, right? You've got the FDA, you've got the DEA. And so you've got state laws that don't interact correctly with federal laws, or you've got exemptions that are still lingering from COVID. And if you don't know what those laws say, you could be fine in your state, but violating federal law, or vice versa. Or maybe you're in a position where you're working in one state, cross lines, going into another state, neighboring state, right? And you don't know the laws of that state. So legal updates, understanding the laws of how things operate, I think is another big point. And then lastly, I mentioned this kind of with your leases and landlords, but vendors as well. And there's a lot of vendors here. But ultimately, when you buy something and you sign on to something, you're a client now, right? And you expect certain things. And you might sign a contract, a lease for a piece of equipment, or maybe you're buying software or products or things like that. You need to be really clear on what the rights and responsibilities are of each party, right? Again, it comes down to a contract. What's it say in there? If you're leasing equipment and something goes wrong with that piece of equipment, you want to figure out before you take that equipment and start making payments on it, what do I do if something goes wrong? Who do I talk to? Who's responsible? What if this is a lemon and this device doesn't work anymore? Now I've got lost revenue, or the marketing doesn't work the way it's supposed to. I think having conversations with those folks ahead of time, and to the extent that you can, include it in whatever purchase contract you have or lease, right? You make sure that it's very clear, who's responsible, what happens in these scenarios, right? And I think you only start to learn those things and understand those things is when you go through that experience once, and now you know for the next time. I was speaking with someone earlier who said, I've been doing this for a couple years now, and I've learned a lot, right? And that means that there's been a lot of bad days of I thought that I was doing something, and all of a sudden this happened instead, and I found out the hard way, right? And that's going to happen. That's business. But from a legal standpoint, if you're not really on top of it, that could really create I think a lot of bad issues for you as a business owner. And again, my goal is always try to be preventative, try to think of all of these scenarios, or at least many of these scenarios, right? Talk to those in your community, attend events like this, learn about what the goods and the bads are, and then if you can take that home and apply it to practice, I think that's a best case scenario for you. So that's all I have for this session. I'll be back to talk a little bit more about compliance in general. We'll talk about some other things within the industry. I got, I guess, a couple minutes. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take some, because you've got a lawyer up here that will give some general advice. And then if you want to ask a deeper question, I'll be here for a little bit after as well. All right. Very good. Well, thank you, and I will turn it over. Oh, yes. Are you asking about me? Yeah, so my firm is a national firm, so we've got licenses in almost every state, and so with that, yeah, we can service clients all over. Yep, absolutely.